We're going to do things just a little bit differently this morning than a usual Sunday morning lesson, in that I want to ask you to go to an Old Testament chapter, 2 Kings chapter 5. And the entirety of our time together in study will be in that chapter. We may only leave it once, perhaps twice the entire time. These 27 verses are our place of focus for our study together. So if you would open there, you'd be in a great spot, and I would love it if everyone who had a Bible would have their Bibles open to that text. When I mention 2 Kings chapter 5, you may already know what you're going to find when you get there. Others still may not have been sure, but as soon as you got there and you saw the man's name in verse 1, you knew why we went there. And if you're not familiar, it's the story of a guy named Naaman. Naaman's story in a nutshell is this. He is an officer of the army of a foreign nation, and he is a leper. Leprosy was a skin condition that was contagious and painful and usually a death sentence. Throughout a series of events, Naaman comes in contact with a prophet who says, if you will dip 7 times in the Jordan River, you will be cleansed. And ultimately, Naaman does dip 7 times in the Jordan River, and in verse 14, his skin is clean like a child, and he is healed. You probably knew that story. Every preacher has the Naaman baptism story in his arsenal somewhere, because this is a great text to help people understand how God connects the physical interaction with water to a spiritual cleansing. And it goes nicely in a line of studies like that. For instance, in Genesis 6 through 10, the entire world was burdened with sin, and the Lord baptized globally in water the whole earth so that the earth could emerge clean and new. Some years later, the Red Sea parts, and the Israelites go through, and God has a national baptism. You following me? Global baptism. Then a national baptism of the Israelites, and they come through clean and new. And now an individual baptism in water for physical cleansing of a fatal ailment. And if you study all of those, when you sit down with someone in Acts chapter 2 and the Lord says that we ought to be baptized in water for the remission of our sins, it makes perfect sense that God would connect you interacting with water so that He could bring about a cleansing from us. In fact, it would make less sense if it wasn't the case, because God has used water in that way so long. So if you were not familiar with this text, that is usually why we go here, and for good reason. But this is probably the first Naaman sermon you've ever heard that is not about baptism, though all of that is still there for you and quite useful. Instead, there are some other things about his conversion and also who he is compared to in this chapter that has drawn my interest today, and I just want you to see it with me. So let's begin with this. When we open in verse 1, we have a man named Naaman who is a dying man. In verse 1, Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, highly respected, and by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but this is a godless guy. This guy has no concept of a monotheistic one Lord. He believes in multiple gods, and he's never been a believer in the Yahweh God. He's a lost, confused, dying man. But by the end of his story, in verse 14, as we already referenced, he is a living man again. He's not cursed by death in that way. He goes and dips himself, verse 14, 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Awesome, awesome story. Here's my question. How did he get from dying to living? Who was involved in that story? This is my favorite part about the Naaman episode, is that Naaman on his own would have never gotten from lost and confused to saved and refreshed had it not been for people in his life who were on missions of mercy and helped to get him where he needed to go. So I want to talk to you about the characters for just a little bit. Let's pick up in verse 2 and read verses 2 through 4. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus spoke this girl who is from the land of Israel. Okay, simple math. No little servant girl, no cleansing. One of my favorite parts about the characters involved in this story is you have two kings, two big name guys, the king of Aram and the king of Israel, both pretty much knuckleheads and not helpful. The ones who are supposed to know everything know nothing. The king of Aram's like, if she says so, just go. You know, he just sends him. He can't help him. And then Naaman gets to Israel and he goes to the king of Israel and he's terrified because he has zero clue what to do. The kings are useless in this story. The little servant girl saves the entire thing. And one of the things I love about her is we do not know her name, but she introduces hope into the life of a dying man. Who are our little servant girls today? I'm looking for some little servant girls. Mr. Watts over there, are you a little servant girl? I hope you are. Little servant girls may not know everything about everything, although he does know quite a bit, but may not know the entire method by which one be saved, or be able to teach that entire method, or know how to handle every situation, but they know how to get you in contact with someone who does. Evangelism is messy and complex and awesome because it's a process of someone who has no clue getting saved. And what I think is great about it is oftentimes among God's people, there are these little servant girls who just say, come and visit our church and I'll introduce you to someone who can help you. Let me introduce you to one of our shepherds here. They can help you. Let me introduce you to Kris. Maybe he can help you. I don't know how to answer your question, but I know someone who does. I pray all the time that the Lindale church is full of little servant girls who are in uncomfortable situations. She's a servant. She's a slave. She wasn't in her happiest place, folks. She's a slave who's been taken from her family. And yet, even in the most uncomfortable of situations, she's like, I really wish my master, who's enslaved me, would go meet this guy who could help him. Love the little servant girl. But then ultimately, in verses 8, 9, and 10, he comes across a man named Elisha who is able to give him that truth. It happened, this is after the king couldn't help. King of Israel's terrified. He thinks it's all ploy to get him in trouble. But in verse 8, it happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman, verse 9, came with his horses and his chariots, and he stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. That's not super complicated. That's not, hey, let me sit you down and walk you through a course for a few months and see if you're a candidate for cleansing. You're dying, you're a candidate for cleansing. You need relief, you're a candidate for relief. So if you have faith, go to this dirty river. Makes no sense to Naaman. We'll talk about that in a minute. No sense at all. Go to this dirty river and dip in it 7 times. At some point in evangelism, somebody has to look at someone and say, this is what you need to do. There's room for building relationships and rapport. There's room for kind of developing it over time. But if you take too much time, you're going to have a dead Naaman. You're going to have somebody who came for healing, and the one who knew exactly what he needed to do, him hawed along until his nose fell off. Like that's what happened with leprosy. He didn't wait. He sends a messenger because he doesn't even really know him. He just sends a messenger out and says, if you go dip in the river, then you will be cleansed. Who are our Elishas in the room? Oh. We're trying to make everyone into an Elisha. Have you noticed? You're going, oh, we've noticed. Evangelism studies and gospel message booklets and big pictures and foundation material and over again and cards stacked everywhere. Yeah. We need more Elishas. The harvest is plentiful because there are a lot of dying people out there. The workers are not so much. Love this. Now, as you probably know, and we'll dig into it more in a moment, Naaman was greatly confused by this instruction. In fact, he had an ungodly reaction. He was angry about it. He didn't understand why you wouldn't do something more noble in order to be cleansed, but dipping in the river 7 times, and it kind of sounds like people with baptism sometimes. Look, you just go down in this water, and God does this work, and you come up new, and you unite with Christ, and people are like, I don't get it. In fact, it's kind of frustrating that you think I need to do, so there's water back here if you're a visitor. I need to do some confusing, odd, off-putting thing, but then comes these servants. And these guys don't get names either. I guess they're just not that important, but that's kind of the point of this, as you see where I'm going today. I got a little bait and switch lined up for you, is that we don't need to know their names because it's not about them. It's not about how awesome they are, how righteous they are, how many people that they saved. It's just the fact that his servants, verse 13, come in and they speak to Naaman and they say, my father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So they come in and say, calm down a minute. Like, aren't you glad it's simple? Why does it need to be complicated? And why are you overcomplicating it? I know it's not what you've expected, but what harm would it be to believe and go get into a river? So he listened. And he went down and he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he became clean. Who are our servants in the room? Our diakonos, a little throwback to deaconhood. Who are the people in this room? Maybe you didn't set up the initial context. Somebody came and visited our church, but you didn't meet them before. They just came and visited, but you got to know them. And the people who came and visited our church, they sat down with the preacher or with an elder, and they're learning the truth, but it's not how they were raised, and they're kind of confused. Or I get up and preach something sometimes, and they sit on row 8, and it just hits them the wrong way. Like, I don't like the way Kris said that, or I don't get that, or I'm frustrated by that. Don't cock your head sideways, Allison. People do that all the time. And they want to leave in a huff. Where are our servants in the room who intercept them? Who take them out to lunch? Who have them in their home? And who say, look, I know some of what you're hearing is a little tough, it's a little confusing, it's a little hard, but isn't it simple? And isn't it what the Bible says? And you help them see how great this is by telling them your story. And all of this comes together. Like, this man isn't just saved out of nowhere. God is using the agent of those who introduce peace, those who share the truth, and those who are a voice of reason. Now, what you might not know is that there's a little bit more to this story. So let's read it together. In verse 15, I'm going to read through verse 19, give you a little bit more, and I'm adding this to the bottom. Ultimately, Naaman had to go back to his home, which was an absolute godless, false god, idol-worshiping land. And in verse 15, we're going to dig into this more in a moment. But in verse 15, he tries to give him a gift. We'll read that in a minute. Pick up in verse 17. Naaman said, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules' load of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings, nor will sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. Naaman's repenting. He said, I'm not going back to serve other gods. I'm only going to serve Yahweh God from now on. In this matter, may the Lord pardon me. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. So Naaman is scared, because he's got to go back to a godless nation where nobody even can spell Lord there. It's all Gods, lowercase g. And he said, when I get back, I'm never going to worship an idol ever again. And I want to take the dirt. He was kind of God worshipers, like multi-God worshipers were big on geography. So he's like, let me take some earth and I'll pour it in my back room where I live. And I'll go, okay, now I'm on holy ground. But he said, they're going to make me go into the temple and they're going to make me bow down there. And I'm going to have to do what I'm told, but I'm not going to worship that God. I'm only going to worship God. What's going to happen to me? Do people have questions after they become Christians? Do they have questions about the big changes in their lives or some of the issues that they have or some of the family influences? Are there things that they don't get? Are there changes that take time? You're like, yeah, still. What did Elisha say? 3 words. Go in peace. Now, everybody, boy, don't read the commentators on this, okay? Because they go on and on with, so you're saying it's okay to be in an idol's temple for years afterwards as long as you don't want to be there? I'm telling you, he said, go in peace. He's got a brand new person. What I mean is not like brand new baptized into the church. I mean, this guy's never even known Yahweh God before. He's just been introduced to Yahweh God for the very first time in his entire life, and God healed him. He's got a long process of figuring out what that's going to look like. Naaman said, go in peace as you endeavor on that process. Did he expect growth, change? Sure he did. But he gave him grace. I heard that in the prayers this morning, and I'm thankful. As a result of all of this, you have a living man. Now, I hope that you can see how evangelism works, because this is maybe the best story in the world to show that to you. It takes characters who get involved and play their role. Everybody has something to do. But in the end, if I could go back to Naaman for a moment, in the end, I think it's important to note that even with all the right people in the right places, little servant girls handing out cards, talking about our Bible classes, inviting people to church, connecting them with wisdom, even our elders here and other preachers in the room, teaching the truth and sharing the truth, and even with great encouragers and assurances of God's grace, it still comes down to the person, If it didn't come down to the person out there, then we'd just get all of our part right and we'd start building a huge building. But what I want you to see is Naaman, though he was utterly confused and godless, was a great candidate for healing. Can I show you 3 words? 1, he understood the desperation of his situation. You ever try to fix someone by asking them to change their life if they don't think they're in a desperate situation? You ever tried that? That's fun. Hey, look, we can get your health better if you'll make these changes, or we can get your life better if you'll make these changes. If they're looking at their life going, I kind of like my life the way that it is, what are the chances you're going to change them? Somewhere around 0.0 with a bunch of little zeros. But let me tell you about Naaman. He knows he's in trouble. He is desperate. I am a leper. I am an outcast. Whatever skin disease, whatever level of it he had, he is in the worst of the worst situation possible for their time. He knows he needs healing. So when he hears the opportunity at something better, he goes to the king and he begs to get to go. And he loads up all of his goods and the king's goods and riches, and he travels down and he finds out, and they send him to some little nobody prophet, and he goes to him. He's desperate enough to listen to a little servant girl. That's desperation. And that's the first thing that made him a great candidate to be saved. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, because I want to talk about you guys and me who've been Christians for a while, but I just want you to note that in order for someone who's not a Christian, who is lost in this world, to find their way home, they have to understand how desperate their situation is because of their own sin and troubles. Now, he kind of got out of sorts a little bit when he was told what to do. Okay, here's what you need to do. You need to go down to this river and dip 7 times. And if you'll pick up with me in verse 10, Elisha said, here it is, it's really simple. You go and you be baptized 7 times in the water, everything is better. Naaman was furious. This is an ungodly response. I'm not justifying his response. He was furious. And he went away and said, behold, I thought. Hey, little side note. Every single text in the whole Bible that begins with behold, I thought, has something not so great after it. Man's thoughts and God's thoughts are not the same, but I do understand, don't you, that it's not easy to just sync them up. Okay, I'll just think like God thinks and everything will be great. That's not easy. It's hard and frustrating to go, this is what I expected and this is what God said. This is what I thought would happen and this is what God is doing. He's having a human emotion. He's furious. Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord, his God, hasn't even become his own yet, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. And then he says, are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and he went away in a huff, in a rage. Now, you might think there's nothing good about this scene, but I think that there is something good. He's being honest. I love honesty. I don't always love honesty. But I love the idea of, this is what I think about what I'm hearing. This is what I feel about what I'm hearing. I don't like what I'm hearing. I challenge what I'm hearing, and I'm willing to just pour all that out on the table. You bring me someone who's not yet a Christian, to whom we introduce the gospel to, and they get mad about it. And they tell you why they're mad about it. And they completely are honest with you with every frustration that they have. We can save that person. Give me one of those other people, though. You know those other people? You're just trying to help them. and they won't answer any of your questions. And they won't tell you how they feel, and they don't want to talk about how they feel, and they keep it all pinned up because of this little thing called pride. And they won't even tell you. I'd rather you tell me that you're mad at me and us go work it out than you just walk past me with a token handshake for 3 years, okay? Okay, I got a little personal there. I apologize. Honesty is good. So it's a negative emotion, but at least he's honest, which allows his servants to come in and say, okay, I see where you are there. Thanks for sharing. Now let me see if I can help you out. And he does help him out. And so he finds clarity through expression. If you're here and you're not yet a Christian, or you're not sure if you're a Christian and you're frustrated about this whole thing, go find an advocate and just share it. There's power in that. Now, ultimately, he obeys, doesn't he? And we know that. And afterwards, he's basically Zacchaeus. Anybody remember Zacchaeus? He's a wee little man, and a wee little man was he and stuff, and he climbs up in a sycamore tree, which reminds me of the fact that I saved our 2 sycamore trees out there in the corner of the property about 4 years ago. It has nothing to do with the sermon, but I'm really proud of saving those trees. Zacchaeus climbed up in one of those trees. He was a tax collector. He was loathed. He had made all kinds of mistakes, but he was desperate enough to go climb up in a tree and beg for mercy. And he was honest about his life, and it all turned to charity for him. When he realized that even though he could be honest about what he'd done, he said, I'm going to return everything that I took. And if I defrauded anyone, I will give them 4 times as much. That's our guy. And I want you to read it because it's awesome stuff you see in new converts sometimes. When he returned, this is after Naaman was cleansed, verse 15. When he returned to the man of God with all his company and came and stood before him and said, behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from your servant. You see it? He just wants to give. But he said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing, Elisha said. And he urged him to take it. Please take it. But he refused. Naaman said, well, if not, then give me some ground of earth so that I can at least be connected to you and God as I go. And in verse 19, go in peace. You know you have true appreciation when you're so thankful for what has happened to you that you just want to start giving. You ever met people like that? Like they're so free and they're happy and they've just been given the greatest gift ever given and they just want to return. It's called gratitude, by the way. It's called level 3 gratitude. Where you're so thankful for what has just happened to you that you just want to go and help people. I'll tell you a little story without getting too specific. I went to the doctor in the Baytown area one time, and I had a little problem. And they said, you're going to have a surgical procedure to help with that problem, and I don't like that kind of stuff. And I went there for my last surgery pre-op for this little problem. And he was like, well, we're going to have to do this. And he said, well, let me go ahead and try something. And he tried something, and it hurt a lot. I mean, he tried something, and it hurt a lot. In fact, I remember going out to the ladies at the desk and saying, did you guys hear me back there? And they're like, yeah, baby, we heard you. I'm sorry. Oh, man. But I felt so much better. It hurt a lot. But after that, all the pain was gone. He said, hey, you're not going to need any surgery, and everything's going to be just fine, and everything's going to be great. And I left there like skipping to the car. And I stopped at the convenience store, and there was I'd stopped there to get gas on the way in. And I stopped on the way out. I'm like, I'm going to stop and get myself a Dr. Pepper or something. I don't drink that stuff, but man, I'm just feeling so good. And there was the same homeless guy there. And the first time I walked right by that guy, but on my way back, I was like, here you go. I don't know. I gave him some money. I don't know. But my point was I was just so ecstatic that I was better, that I just wanted to give. That's Zacchaeus. And that's this guy, and that is fantastic. And if you could just bottle up that charity, and I'm kind of letting you guys in on where we're going a little bit, sometimes that charity fades over time. Sometimes that sense of, this is unbelievable, give, just kind of fades. But in him, it didn't, and this is what made him such a great man. Okay, let me do something else here in our last little bit. There are more verses in this chapter than what we have seen. We've gone up through verse 19, but there's a little more. Did you know that Naaman's leprosy came back? Who knew that? Naaman was a leper, and his leprosy was removed from him, and then his leprosy came back, settled on the man. The man lived the rest of his life with leprosy, and his descendants forever suffered from leprosy. Who knew that? Except the man was not Naaman. The man was Gehazi. Gehazi in the story is a righteous man. Gehazi knows the Yahweh, Lord of heaven. Gehazi is mentioned first there in verse 20. Gehazi was with Elisha when he gifted the woman with a child. Gehazi was with Elisha when the child died and Elisha raised the child from the dead. Gehazi had seen amazing, miraculous things. Gehazi knew of the power of God. And in this story, he is a living man who knows the Lord until the end when he's a dying man. Verse 1 has leprosy in it by a godless guy named Naaman. But read verse 27. Verse 26. Elisha said to Gehazi, "Did not my heart go with you when the man turned his chariot to meet you?" Verse 27, "Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever." So he went out from his presence a leper, as white as snow. Do not miss this part of the story. This is the lifer. Are you a lifer? I'm looking at some lifers here. I'm talking about people who are already Christians, who've been Christians for a while, who know the Lord, who have faith in the Lord, who go to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, who have established themselves as workers for the Lord, who are healthy and clean and good and may die in your sins. How does that happen? How does a righteous man end up dying of leprosy like Simon and others we see in the story? Because even though he was a longtime believer who had seen great things and knew great things and did all the right things, there were qualities, stick with me, there were qualities in that new convert that were not in that lifelong Christian. They used to be. I mean, I know Gehazi was this guy at some point, weren't we all? But over the years, something had changed, and I want to show it to you. You see these three things on the left? Those were crucial elements to being cleansed. Gehazi not only didn't have them, he had the opposite of them. Naaman was desperate. He was dying, and he was in need. Gehazi was entitled. Gehazi wasn't in need. Gehazi wasn't in a place of desperation. He didn't have any of those issues that the non-Christian has. He had this sense of deserving something. He had elevated himself as worthy. And the moment we do that, we can lose everything. We elevate ourselves over others. Let me show it to you in the text. I think you'll see it. In fact, I'll go ahead and read verses 20 through the text. So this is after Elisha says, "Hey, go in peace." So off he goes. Off goes Naaman, headed home. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, "Behold, my master has spared this Naaman the Aramean by not receiving from his hands what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and I will take something from him." Where in the world is that coming from? Where did you get in your mind, Gehazi, that said that? And I'm going to tell you, Ben does this with me all the time. He's going to say, "I'm here, you're here." See the difference? Ben gives me that reference a lot of time. You're Naaman, you're a noob, you owe your debts, you owe your dues, you're the worst, I'm better, you really should have paid us off. Like you owe us for joining the club. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm entitled to something. I'm going to go and get it from you because that's the way it's supposed to go. And so he goes to him and he pursues him. When Naaman saw one running after him, he came down from the chariot to meet him and said, "Is all well?" And Gehazi said, yeah, all is well. "My master has sent me, saying, Behold, just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes." Naaman said, "Be pleased to take 2 talents. I mean, Naaman he's the best, right? "Just take double." And he urged him, and he bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothes and gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them before him. When he came to the hill, he took them from their hand, Gehazi did. And Gehazi, this may remind you of Achan, as we say, the one who hid the jewels in the case of the kings. He said, "I took them from their hand," and he deposited them in the house. He hid them in his home, and he sent the men away, and they departed. But he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said to him, "What you been doing?" And he said, nothing. I went nowhere. Then he said to him, did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is it a time to receive money and clothes and olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants? Is that what time it is? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from the presence, a leper as white as snow. This reminds me of so many of the stories Jesus told. I wish I could go on for a long time this morning. I won't. It reminds me of the Good Samaritan who gave, and the Levites and the priests who kept what was theirs. They were better than the man on the side of the road. It reminds me of the ones who labored all day in the vineyard, and they looked with lament upon the 11th hour guy who got everything they got. I've got more than you, more credit, more years of credibility, a better retirement plan coming. And so they were frustrated with that. He is entitled, and in order to carry out his entitlement, he deceives. Now look, Naaman's like, I'm going to be honest, I'm mad. I don't get it, and I'm frustrated, and I'm stomping my feet. But at least Naaman was honest about it. This guy's got problems, Gehazi, this long-termer in the service of God, because in his heart is pride. In his heart is entitlement. In his heart are problems. He has lost that spirit of desperation. But when asked about any of it, he lies. He hides. He builds a lie for Naaman. Hey, Elisha sent me. And when the man of God, by the way, is the man of God good at fixing things? Yeah, man of God's really good at fixing things. And when the man of God comes to him to try to fix it, he doesn't want to talk about it. This lifelong servant, this true believer, is exhibiting the traits of a lost person who can't be saved. Because in him are things that don't belong, and he don't want to talk about them. So he is deceptive. I kind of see a Zacchaeus and a who? Anybody? Anybody with me? A Zacchaeus and a Judas. Judas walked with Jesus and talked to him. He's supposed to know. He's supposed to be the guy in the best spiritual place. But Judas didn't feel desperation. Judas was deceptive, and he was driven by greed. Listen to me. I don't care how long you've been a Christian or how nice your coat is, and I have a nice coat on today. If at any point you get calloused to any point where this is just about you and God and everybody around you that needs help, that needs your patience, that needs grace, that needs training, that isn't worth it, that's below you, but you can't get below them, then you have a problem. And what may happen is, the very cleansing that new converts experience in Jesus may be a leprosy that lands on me. And because I stand in the name of discipleship, but I'm entitled and greedy and I'm hiding darkness within me, it may not just stick to me, it may stick to Luke and Nick and Ella and Hannah and Braden and their kids. Because in the name of the Lord, I am prideful and I don't want to talk about it. And I think more about myself than others. This is an interesting chapter because maybe you read it for the first time and you go, why are we talking about this guy and then this guy? But the leprosy at the beginning and the end of the chapter ties it together. It's about who's going to be the leper. Hey, I got an idea. Let's none of us be the leper. How's that sound? How about nobody be the leper? How about the demons get cast out and they don't go find housing in anyone? I think that'd be great. And while that is something we hope for, we need to learn a lesson here. I'm done with Naaman. If you're not a Christian, you need to become a Christian. If you've not been baptized in water, God's been showing you since Genesis how important that is. And we've got plenty of people here who can help you. I want to talk to any Gehazis that we have in the room because there are two things that you need to know. One, it's time for a reset. Reset. Doesn't matter if you've been a Christian for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Doesn't matter if you're a preacher, a lifer, a deacon, an elder, a wife of any, it doesn't matter. If we've lost our sense of others and Him and service and lowliness, it's time for a reset. You say, what do you mean by reset? Go to Matthew 18. Matthew 18. I told you we might leave one time. This is our only time to leave the text. And we're not going back, so you can leave it behind. Matthew chapter 18. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" You see that? Greatness, entitlement, better than, more worthy of. You see that language a lot with Peter. We've given up everything. What do we get? They had that get issue, that tenure concept. So Jesus says, "You want to be great? No problem. Go get me a kid." So he calls a child to himself and he sets him before him and he says, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as a child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Bible trivia question. Who needs to be converted? Look at this behind me. Let's say we're not talking about leprosy anymore. We're talking about sin and consequences. Which of these two needs to be converted? Naaman needed to be converted. I think we all know that. He needed to be converted to truth and obeying the truth and believing in the one true God. But here's something that I think we missed. You may have been a Christian for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and it is time for you to be converted. You say, "What do you mean be converted? I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian a long time." It is time for you to be converted back to a place of desperation, of seeing your weaknesses as consequential and a big deal and cannot be tolerated, and to be honest about it. This is what I'm doing and this is how I feel and it's not right. And I need help with that. And to get back to giving instead of taking. Others instead of self. I need to be converted like a child. He's talking to the apostles. They're the big names in the group. If the biggest names in the group needed to be converted, I'm pretty sure there are points in my life when I need to be converted. I hope everybody here is willing to be converted, to be more like this new convert. And by the way, we love our new converts around here. If you're a new Christian, you're the best thing going on. The smile on your face. I used to say that a new convert, if the church building burnt down on a Saturday night, a new convert would show up Sunday morning for Bible class and open their Bible survey book in the ashes with smoke billowing all around them, because new converts want to give. They just want to give. I just want to give out of gratitude. Hey, one final thought for those of us who've been Christians a while. Part of what got Gehazi in this mess, look on the right side of the screen. See all the characters involved in saving Naaman? Isn't that cool? All these characters involved. Let me tell you how many characters were involved in ruining Gehazi's life. That would be a big fat zero. Gehazi got no help. Gehazi didn't ask for help. Gehazi didn't go and confide in anyone. Gehazi didn't say, "I'm really frustrated," or "I'm feeling a lot of greed. Will you help me?" He tried to do it all on his own. Nobody can be saved all on their own. God uses the advocacy of helpers and encouragers, and no one who's in the church but falling into sin can get back without the good work of what God has planned. So I just want to say this to you. Get help. If you're not a Christian, and you want to know what it means to become a Christian, get help. If you've been in the church for years, but there is something here that does not belong. Does it happen? It happens. Ephesians, the church at Ephesus lost that heart. If you're hiding something, if you're calloused and angry and frustrated and sitting on it, if the focus and the pronouns have lost that sense of others, get help. You need it. And that's what God's people are here to do. We offer the front row to any who want help. If that's something that is important to you, it was important to Naaman and Gehazi, it could have changed everything. I wonder who's in the room today. And getting help could change everything. If that's you, come now as we stand and sing.